Okay. Good afternoon and warm greetings to everyone present. And thank you for joining us. I'm Jacques Bekes, and I will chair this first session of this webinar. And my colleague, Dr. Tanya van Wyk, will chair the second session. So thank you for making time to be with us on this platform. We are looking forward to a fruitful engagement on current serious and relevant issues. Before I give over to Professor Jerry Pillay, the Dean of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at University of Pretoria, who will do the official word of welcome, and Professor Stefan de Beer, the Director of the Center for Faith and Community. I just want to share some protocols that will assist us with the live streaming of this session. So I would like to friendly request that you switch off your microphone and your camera, as this will help with the online connection and streaming. Only the speaker in turn must switch on the camera and microphone. Also, you will see on your right-hand side, there's a chat function. Please use the chat function to post your questions or comments. We will have 15 minutes of discussion at the end of each presentation, which is not much time, but we will try our utmost best to address as many questions in the time frame provided. So thank you for your cooperation. I will now give over to Professor Pillay and then Professor de Beer. So Professor Pillay, I give over to you.
Thank you so much, Jacques. I want to say a special welcome to all our colleagues and friends who are joining us on this webinar. And I'm mindful that we have people not only from South Africa, but also from across the globe. And a special welcome to all of you today. Thank you for joining us on this very special webinar where we have a conversation on race and gender. In spite of all the challenges that we are facing with regards to COVID-19, it is indeed important that we continue to dialogue and act on significant issues facing us, not only in South Africa, but across the globe. We all know that the world is in crisis. The crisis is not only about the devastating impact of the coronavirus on countries, communities, families, and individuals, but we're also facing other pandemics. And one such pandemic is the pandemic of racism. And also, in the words of the President of South Africa, the epidemic of gender-based violence. We know that these are realities that we face and they are with us, and more so even during this time of lockdown, we continue to actually experience them even at its worst. In South Africa and across the globe, racism continues to surface. It is not uncommon to hear racial utterances or read people's minds and feelings as they express them on the social media. The recent murder of George Floyd in the USA sparked a global cry for justice, racial justice. We have seen police exercise brutality in terms of how they deal particularly with Black individuals. We have seen and we continue to see, even in South Africa, how Black people are treated, abused, oppressed, exploited, and disadvantaged. The struggle to breathe is more than a single or more events. It is ingrained in systemic structures that continue to assert white privileges and power. And some may say, but that is not true in a South African context. My response is that politics might have changed, but has there been a shift in the economic power, in social development? I'm sure that if we have to answer these questions truthfully, we will come up with different answers. All of these things continue to perpetuate itself, and opportunities do exist for selected groups and communities. It is also quite concerning in South Africa at this time, the escalating violence that women are experiencing, and also children. In this time of the lockdown, one would have expected people to behave better, but the lockdown has actually generated more abuse and violent attacks on women, as we see daily in our media, reported to us. We see senseless killings, murders and rape of women and children being abused. And we wonder, with these horrific information and experiences, what is going on in our society. Well, we are in a crisis. And the crisis is not only a crisis that speaks about the fact that we are in crisis, but there's something more to it. The crisis also alludes to the fact that we are living in a world, or even in a country and society, that is essentially sick. Sick sometimes to the core. We need to do more as men to stand up and take responsibility, to denounce abuse and violence against women and children, to own up to our own prejudices and inadequacies, and to work towards transformation, justice, and peace, respecting and seeing every person as created in the image of God. So as church, academia, and society, we need to join together to make a difference. And we somehow are hoping that these conversations that we are starting with today, and we will have more about it, and Stefan will tell you about that, will help us to actually have fruitful engagement, but also provide for us directives in terms of the future and how we may explore and engage these challenges that we are facing in our country and in the world at large. So racism, gender-based violence is here, and these things continue to live with us. How do we respond to these? Well, I'm hoping somehow that our conversation today will help us. It's not new conversations, it's conversations that have been taking place over many years. But the time has come for us to be able to be more proactive and to engage active action in terms of dealing with these challenges that we face often on a daily basis. So a special thanks to all of you for joining us today, and my sincere thanks to Stefan de Beer and the Center and the Department of Practical Theology for putting these conversations together. And for those who are to chair, thank you too for standing in. And for all of you who have joined us, a special welcome, and I trust our conversation will be fruitful. Thank you so much. Do enjoy this conversation. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Professor Pillay. I give now over to Professor Stefan de Beer.
Thank you, Jock and Prof. Pillay. I will be very short, just to locate the conversation for a moment. Just to say that apparently I see Boothler also said they just have load shedding in their area. Moss also just load shedding. That's another pandemic, Jerry, has just set in where Moss is staying. So he's trying to get back online to be with us because he's our first presenter. So just to locate this, as Aldine has already said, we hope to open up new conversations around some old and difficult topics in our faculty, but also beyond, to discern what doing theology might have to look like amidst and beyond COVID-19. And perhaps we should wrestle with what that will look like, because we cannot only intellectually speak about issues such as race, gender, the earth, the economy. It's about our bodies. It's about the spaces we occupy. It's about livelihoods. It's indeed about life and death. And we recognize how the pandemic surfaced societal fault lines, the sickness that Jerry spoke about in more glaring ways than before. Socio-economic inequality, environmental disaster, inappropriate health and educational infrastructure, institutional captivities, and so forth. In the context of I can't breathe, What is the Spirit longing to breathe into our theological actions and reflections at a time when the earth and humanity alike gasp for breath? How should we consider doing theology at this moment in time? Do we dare continue as usual, or are the cries of our times prompting us to deep conversions even? Not only is this therefore a time of crisis and threat, but perhaps if we discern well together, it might become a time also of new opportunity and new resurrections. So thanks for joining us today for this first conversation, COVID-19, race and gender. But we also would like for you to watch this space, as Lance Thomas will send you information. The second conversation will be on COVID-19, the economy and the environment, on the 24th of July, same space, 12 o'clock on a Friday. And the third conversation will be on the 7th of August, and the topic will be doing theology now, how, what, and with whom. And some of the exciting presenters we will have is Professor Lorenzo Fioramonti. He used to be with us at UP, and then he became the Italian Minister of Education. Professor Damaris Pashito. Damaris is with us on this call. She's a feminist theologian working on gender development, religion in Kenya. Daniel Pilario is the Dean of the St. Vincent School of Theology outside of Manila. And when he's not teaching, he is also the pastor of a garbage dump church outside of Manila. He will be with us for the third conversation. And we asked all of them to give specific attention to the kind of theological leadership and action they think we now require at personal, institutional, and epistemological levels, if we want to be participants of perhaps radically new futures. So watch the space, and we hope that this is just the beginning of deep conversations, and at some point we hope some of this could eventually again be face-to-face, of course, and that safe spaces will be created in which to have tough conversations, but conversations in which the Spirit might want to breathe something new into all of us in terms of some of the death-dealing realities we face around us. So thank you, Jock, and thank you to all of us, for all of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Stefan. Can I repeat myself? Please, can you just mute your cameras and your microphone? It's earing into our bandwidth, so if you just can switch off your cameras as well. And then I just want to make sure whether Reverend Moss is online. I heard there's load shedding.
He's not yet online. I'm just trying to connect him again.
Okay. If that is the case, then maybe Dr. Van Wyk, I will give over to you. And then maybe Professor Charlene can start with her presentation first.
Hi, everyone. I just want to make sure from Lance and the rest of the team and from Professor Charlene if she's ready to talk now, because I understood that there is a strict format of the program to follow. So if someone can just give me the go-ahead, then I will absolutely introduce our speaker and go on. Charlene, thanks. I see you are fine. Lance and Stefan, can I get the go-ahead from you as well?
It's perfect. We deliberately made the program quite tight. So yes, I think if Charlene is ready, we can go. Thanks, Tanya.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm Tanya Van Wyk from UP, and I'm in systematic theology. A lot of you know me, and some of you have read things over the years. It's my real privilege to introduce Professor Charlene van der Walt. I know her well. I've listened to her many times. She is a person that can be quite adamant and fiery, and that is something that we need right now. So I'm privileged to introduce her. Just a few notes about her. She is currently associate professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where she directs the gender and religion program. And she worked extensively on the intersection of gender, health, and theology, specifically sexuality and queer studies, and of course the contextual Bible reading. One of the last papers I listened to was specifically on this topic, and she really challenged the audience Her doctoral work was done in the field of Old Testament at Stellenbosch University. Charlene, it's a real privilege, and I give over to you. You have about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Tanya, thank you for the kind introduction, and colleagues, welcome to this brave conversation. Stefan and the colleagues at the Center and colleagues at UP, thank you for the opportunity to join you and to be amongst you. I hope Moss would go before me to introduce a number of things. So my talk almost presupposes that he's already introduced a bunch of things, especially around the race intersection, but I will be focusing, as the title of my presentation also signifies, around the violent intersections with religion and gender as it's compounded by COVID-19. I want to thank you for the opportunity for us to be together amidst our profound separation. I have found COVID-19 realities to be hugely disorientating. So rather than having loads of things to say, I have found myself to be mostly silent. After the initial hype around Zoom consultation and webinar interactions, I found myself opting out of most virtual meetings just because of the hyper reality of closeness that this medium sort of creates, making it seem like we're together. And then when that meeting ends, the profound absence and the bankruptcy of this virtual connection. And secondly, the realization and the growing realization that no one really knows. We don't really know what tomorrow holds. We don't know how institutions or systems or realities will unfold. And the speculation that this time has brought about, I found really debilitating. And I think this has impacted us globally, but also closer to home locally. What has, however, happened to my mind is that our reality has been brought into sharper focus. The things that we could brush over and maybe rush past has announced themselves. And when I think about, if I take stock about the issues, I would say the dehumanizing and the fragile reality created by our economic systems is one. Secondly, just to think about how many people have lost their jobs and their livelihoods, how people have to hustle to make a living, and now in the lack of spaces to hustle, how many people are left vulnerable. Secondly, and as the Dean has also noted at the beginning, it's exposed how thin the veneer is of our racial integration. I think the death of George Floyd and the cruel poetics of his final plea of life, "I can't breathe," that's also the theme of this webinar series, Floyd has captured the experience of countless of people of color having to navigate context where whiteness and the inherent privilege that holds has gone uninterrogated. I think it sparked important conversations around Black Lives Matter, and it's forced us to engage. And I have been part online of numerous conversations with sort of the pushback to Black Lives Matter, saying all life matters, and of course all lives does indeed matter, but sometimes life forces us to sit down and to slow down and to really think of the lived realities of those systemically excluded, oppressed, and dehumanized. It's brought into sharper focus, and Jerry also referred to that in the beginning, the civil war of gender-based violence staged against the bodies of women and sexually diverse people in the South African landscape. I think a bunch of activists around gender-based violence and also climate change is probably sighing and saying, well, it's high time that you arrive at this conversation. Welcome to the party. We've been here. We've been exposing these realities, speaking to these realities for a while. And it is nice for you to show up and for you now to have the political will to address these issues. The sharp increase in gender-based violence since the COVID-19 South African lockdown, a reported 500% increase, widely reported on and discussed, also led the President of South Africa on the 17th of July to say that we are indeed in a second pandemic of gender-based violence. I think it's noteworthy to note that this confirms that what's happening around gender-based violence, I think, is highlighting for us a specific landscape that I think we need to reflect on. Firstly, it again highlights this idea that this myth about stranger rape and some brute in the dark alleys who's going to attack you and rape you, although this does happen, it's not indeed the case very often, as the incidences of rape and gender-based violence that we've experienced is in our homes and in our close relationships, and dare I say, in the heart of our marriages. The punitive and violent escalation of gender-based violence, the increased number of femicide and the brutal nature of femicide, and the just grotesque examples like the alleged rape of a 2-year-old at the Dr. George Mukari Academic Hospital in Pretoria while she was being isolated for COVID. I mean, just highlights the complexity. I think a bunch of things that's happening also highlights insights by Professor Louise du Toit, who reflected on rape as a torture tactic. How the mere threat of rape and the possibility of being raped and being exposed to gender and sexual violence polices the reality of women. And I always find it really illuminating engaging students on this matter and starting classes on gender-based violence with men and women in my space, mostly men, and then asking, what did you have to do this morning to protect yourself against rape and gender-based violence? To which the women in the class very often would say, I hide my valuables, I travel with friends, I make sure that I'm in very public places. And if your answer also on this webinar today is, I did nothing today to protect myself against gender-based violence, I think it's very important to acknowledge your privilege. I think we've become aware of the compounding effect of COVID. So those who were vulnerable and marginalized before is even more so now exposed to realities that increases vulnerability. So the compounding reality because of oppression, when we engage these realities, especially of the LGBTI community, is becoming very highlighted. As we saw in the time of lockdown, how a 14-year-old girl stabbed the queer dancer Kirven Fortuin from a kasser because she deemed him to be a moffie. The increase in hate crime and the blaming of, especially from the religious sector, of LGBTI people for COVID-19 is alarming. So if this is some of the contextual realities, if this is the realities that's going on in the world, I think it's important for us to reflect on the causality. So if we want to engage this productively, how do we think about what causes this, and how do we address the root causes of gender-based violence? So why is gender-based violence such a prevalent reality in South Africa? It's of course an issue with deep historical roots. It's embedded within our history of inequality and dehumanization. But I've always found the work of Professor Rachel Jukes from the Medical Research Council in Pretoria highly influential and thought-provoking. She says when we think about gender-based violence, it's situated within a constellation of factors. So it's not like we can say, oh, it's because of high rates of poverty that there's gender-based violence in South Africa, or it's because of alcohol abuse and our history of alcohol abuse in this country that there's high rates of gender-based violence. Or our constructions of hypermasculinity, it's because of that. Rachel Jukes helps us to say if we touch on one issue that speaks to the reality of gender-based violence, a whole board or a constellation of factors lights up. But at the heart of gender-based violence, she hooks it to two ideological issues that informs gender-based violence. The first is a culture of violence. She says that our default response in South Africa to situations of conflict and pain and trauma is violence. And secondly, she engages the ideology of male superiority or patriarchy at its heart. I've always found this very helpful because it's quite easy to illustrate how religion and culture informs ideas of male superiority, how it stabilizes patriarchy as a systemic reality, and how it normalizes violence in the midst of conflict. So, firstly, I think I'd like to say that gender-based violence is a systemic problem. It's about individuals and it's about their lives, but if we truly want to engage it, it's situated in systemic realities, and it's informed by the stable and often unquestionable systems of patriarchy and heteronormativity. So this ideology that men are superior to women, and that women exist in relation to men, and that the ideal constellation in which they exist is in marriage and under the headship of men. Secondly, I think it's important to say that these ideas and these systemic realities is the water that we swim in. It's pervasive, it is widely held, it's so everywhere you go that it's very hard often to name it and to speak to it. And that religion and theology and culture often reinforces these ideas. So gender-based violence and homophobic hate crime poses, and I think this is why I'm here today, is to raise some questions and maybe to raise some areas where I think we need to reflect on. I think it holds urgent imperatives for faith communities and for those of us engaged in the landscape of theology and church and faith. It's important also to note that it's often an overlooked sector. So just as it is a sector that greatly contributes to the realities of gender-based violence and homophobic hate crime, I think it holds profound potential for hope and for transformation. It's often a sector that's left unengaged by gender-based violence activists and those advocating for sexual reproductive health and rights, because it's deemed irredeemably part of the problem. So I think it's important, and this is maybe the most important thing I want to say, that it's important for us to develop a new generation of religion and theology scholars on the African context, in the African context, that has, firstly, the language and the vocabulary to engage issues of gender and sexuality, and secondly, the critical and systemic tools to engage systems of oppression. I'd like to end off with some tasks and theological imperatives that I think is important. And I want to state in a disclaimer that it's not easy to engage with these issues that is so systemically foundational, as many of these theological constructions that I will highlight is beloved core beliefs. It's foundational truth. It's doctrinal touchstones. It's the thing that informs our being believers in the world. And it's often ideas and notion that give us comfort and that holds great beauty, but that warrants interrogation if we start our theological reflection, as feminist and queer scholarship would challenge us, by beginning with the bodies and the lived realities of those most affected and marginalized or disenfranchised. We should not be surprised by the pervasiveness of patriarchy or the stability of the notions of male superiority if we continue to engage our patriarchal foundational text in an uncritical way. We need to acknowledge and to grapple with the fact that our foundational text, the Bible that is at the heart of our faith, is a patriarchal text. It's a fact that Scripture promotes patriarchy and that ideas of male superiority and headship is promoted within biblical text. It's predominantly male language that is used to speak about God, and because these ideologies have massive impacts on the bodies of women and the sexual reproductive decision-making of women, I think we need to ask serious questions about who gets to speak about women's bodies and who holds the power in the negotiation of sex. And then secondly, and maybe for some of us this might be a surprise, that, or shocking or surprising, that there should be a negotiation or even a conversation around sex and reproductive health. Patriarchy informs constructions of the institution of marriage that warrants reflection and engagement. Beyond the individual examples, more about the understandable stability of the institution So when we think about the ideas about how marriage is constructed within religious spaces, often the headship of the man, the control and decision-making often align with men, where women and children are almost like part of the possessions. And this system informs toxic theology, where religious leaders, especially within gender-based violence situations in marriage, would often inform a woman to stay in dangerous and life-denying realities, because what God has put together, no man can separate. Thirdly, I think it raises serious questions to our understanding of God's role in suffering and how we as Christians should engage with suffering. I think a lot of women stay within situations, compromised situations, women of faith stay within compromised situations of violence because of the glorification of suffering. So the life of Jesus is this life of suffering, and therefore we should also endure. And it often informs our pastoral care in situations of violence to women who are in vulnerable situations, and interventions that keep women and other vulnerable people in toxic situations. You should stay because there is redemption in your suffering. We become more Christ-like in our suffering, and in the process, not addressing systemic realities of violence, but keeping women in fragile situations. This leads us also to important reflections on forgiveness. And although I think no one will argue with the fact that embarking on processes of forgiveness and healing is highly beneficial, and it is something that is central to our Christian faith, often survivors of gender-based violence are pushed or coerced towards forgiveness of perpetrators in liturgies of healing and in prayer services without engaging with the complex and the hurt of the reality, almost jumping over the complexity and forcing women and those who survived issues of gender-based violence into cheap forgiveness. I think we need deep work thinking about the process of forgiveness around gender-based violence, but also around race and sexuality issues, because I think it informs complexity of victim blaming, often invisible nature of men as perpetrators of gender-based violence, and it places the burden of healing on the survivors of gender-based violence. Finally, I think ideas of shame and sin is something that we need to reflect on. So how often our bodies and our sexuality is engaged with in a paradigm of sin and shame. So this informs a culture of silence where it's impossible to speak about our bodies and about sex within faith spaces. Our bodies is somehow something that we should escape. And as good Christian people, we don't speak about sex. I think the silence informs the silence of the church around issues of gender-based violence. Finally, issues of sex and sexuality, gender-based violence and hate crime urges us to reflect about the direction and the flow of our theological engagement. So rather than starting from theology, starting from the Bible, and then speaking into people's reality, I think feminist and queer scholarship is urging us to say we need to slow down and really listen to the lived realities of those affected by gender-based violence, by hate crime, and by exclusion due to sexuality and gender. So rather than a theology of the body, to start with a body theology. And this leads us to a very serious and foundational question of whose experience matter, and I'm sure most will also pick up on these ideas: who get to speak, who determines our theological agenda. As one who has experienced a great deal of talking about within the faith sector, I think it's important that we create faith spaces where we are not talking about the survivors of gender-based violence and hate crimes, but with them. This is hard, and it's very hard to figure out how to set up these spaces and how it could be spaces that is life-affirming for everyone involved. Because still, when we create those spaces, often within faith communities, and this is something that I'm personally also struggling with, it's important for us not to instrumentalize people's experience. So not to say, oh, we're inviting you to this service to come and perform your pain so that we can understand how it must be to live on the receiving end of gender-based violence. But for us, and I think this is our greatest challenge, but for us to allow survivors of gender-based violence and of hate crimes and discrimination on the basis of gender and sex, to invite them to help us to become who we are supposed to be. And that is a community of justice, care, and of radical hospitality. I thank you.
Wow, thank you, Charlene. That was a fantastic way to just start this conversation. And I've got a separate chat function going on my phone to see if we can get our first speaker, who will now be our second speaker, on the line to start talking. And Lance and Wayne and Jacques will alert me if I don't check my phone. For those of you that are listening in, just alert me via this platform. So Charlene, thank you, and also thank you for keeping to the time beautifully. I did jot a few notes down and I got the chat function going, so there have been a few comments. And I just want to ask maybe either Jacques or Lance or Wayne, someone just to help me check the chat function if I can't get everything on time, because once we start talking, there's going to be, I think, a few more comments in the chat box, but there were a few. And what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of them and then I'm going to describe it and then ask if that specific person wants to say something or add something. And then I'm going to give it back to Charlene to comment, and then we'll see what type of conversation comes from that. So I'm not going to take it in a specific order, but I think the one that jumped out on me, out for me for the first, what really jumped out to me was the comment by Vilna de Beer, who asked about, isn't it time that, you know, we've got a bunch of laws that regulate a lot of things surrounding race and racism, but we don't have the same amount of laws and legal issues when it comes to sexism and you know, even before we get to gender-based violence, if we just get to sexual or sexist utterances in society, we don't have the same type of clamping down on that as we do with regards to racism. So that's the first thing I want to put out to Charlene. And then if Vilna wants to add something to that, you can do that. And then the second theme I want to put out there, where there was been a lot of comments about that, and that is about the church's role in all of this. I mean, we're going to get back to this over and over and over again. And it's about the church's silence. It's about the church's role in creating patriarchal liturgies. And you spoke a little bit about this when you talked about language. So let's take those two broad themes first, namely the one about, you know, regulating sexual utterances, and the second one about the role of the church. Before I give over to Charlene, I just wanted to ask if the people that made those specific comments really want to say something. Vilna, Cheryl, and I think it was the chaplain as well. Do you want to say something specifically to Charlene, or can she respond to that? Okay, so I hear silence. So Charlene, please respond to those two broad themes first. Thanks.
Tanya, thank you for the question, and colleagues, thank you for raising it. Vilna, around your question about gender-based violence and sexism and law reform, I think, I mean, although it's not perfect, of course it's not perfect, I think we live in a democratic constitutional dispensation where we actually have very affirming laws around sex, sexuality, around gender relations. But I think the problematic reality that you are touching on is, and this is something that I've explored a bit around, especially sexual diversity, is the disconnect or the gap between very progressive laws and maybe even fantastic policy within church spaces, even within academic spaces where there's really good policy, and yet people are often very unaware of that policy, and the trickle down of those effects within the lived realities of those affected is often non-existent. So I remember when we had the huge uproar around gender-based violence after the murder of Unene, the UCT student, in the beginning of in last year, there was a huge outcry at my institution, and people were like, why don't we have a policy engaging gender-based violence, and why is the university not doing more? Only to everyone's dismay to realize we've got an excellent policy on gender-based violence. We've got excellent documentation. But the implementation and the way that we make those conversations that live in our classrooms, in our teaching, in our engagement with each other as colleagues, I think that's the place where we need to do more work. How do we translate policy and really good scholarship and good ideas around sexuality and gender-based violence into practice? And I think that's a disconnect that we need to work harder at. And if I had to guess, and Tanya maybe hinted at that also in the engagement of the second question, I think it's about enabling through our pedagogy and through our speaking and our scholarship to develop vocabulary and ways to enhance conversation, where we are actually having these conversations with young men and women in our faith communities, in our classrooms, where it's not something that's only policy, but something that we engage with in our everyday realities. Then secondly, Tanya, the very complicated question, and I try to touch on that by thinking a little bit about the theological imperatives when we think about the church's silence. And I mean, there's been great work done by feminist scholars to think about why is the church silent on HIV. For a very long time, the church was completely silent around HIV and AIDS and around gender-based violence. Why is there this pervasive silence? And I think it holds to some of the things that I addressed, to say that we have a complete lack of skill to talk about our own bodies and our experience of our embodiment. And because there is no language for it, and because the church is sort of ashamed to talk about sex and sexuality, these conversations are hard to be had. But secondly, and this maybe is a hard thing to swallow, is to say that if you systemically benefit from basically, I mean, what's the stats about how many women are in the pews and men in the leadership? If you systemically benefit from the fact that women are silenced and marginalized, why would you be a champion? Why would you engage transformation and reform? I think male leadership within faith communities benefit from women being silenced. And therefore, it's not always so easy to engage these issues as men. I mean, and I really appreciate Jerry's remark right at the beginning to say, it's a moment also for men to take up responsibility, to start these conversations. And I'd like to share a story in this regard. I have students who come through undergrad with me and then do an honors and a master's. And then the other day in a master's class, some of my best students, some of my best male students got up and said, you know, Prof, after everything, I just want to tell you that fundamentally, I don't believe that men and women have equal value. And the way that we engage our faith communities on a Sunday reinforces this idea every Sunday. So we are talking these things in class, and I'm really thankful for it. But when I'm amongst my mates in the changing room at the gym, there's a way that we speak about women. There's a way in which we engage gender and sexuality that informs a culture of violence. And for those conversations, so I can't go into a male locker room and have those conversations. We need strong and prophetic leadership by men to engage these issues.
Thank you so much, Charlene. I'm not seeing very much new comments in the chat box, so I'll highlight one or two of them now because we do have a little bit of time still left. I just want to respond and maybe open up some more space for conversation. Two things about what you've just said. I think when it comes to the issue that Vilna has raised in terms of how these things are organized legally, I think we still live in a society, broadly speaking, although it's not the same everywhere. But if you make a racist remark about someone, you can end up going to jail or lose your job. If you make the same type of comment about a woman, someone says it's bad. It almost happens what the first time when the president spoke to us about the first time he really responded to the scourge of gender-based violence. For me, his first response was like a school principal that caught a bunch of kids second break smoking and told them, "You naughty children, you shouldn't smoke." And then the second time he spoke about this, he was a lot more stronger about this, and he actually, said, "But until our society doesn't realize that you can't make remarks about a woman's clothing, you can't make remarks about, gender roles, until those things don't happen, and until you start speaking, or until you continue speaking about our women and our girls, none of these things are going to change." So there was a marked difference for me from when he first spoke about it until the second time. But that for me speaks to what Vilna has said. And I just wanted to respond to that as well, because there is a marked difference in how we understand, or now these days, thankfully, respond to issues of racism. But the same thing when it comes to sexism and specifically sexual diversity, we're not at the same level. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think many times that the church simply thinks that, especially the Christian church and the institutional church, which I'm part of, thinks that, but we've sorted this issue out. What's your problem? You can become ordained. You can be ministers. You're allowed to choose this and this and this. So I think they have sort of sorted that out. So I think in that way, there's still a lot of stuff to go. And I'm going to ask you to respond to that briefly as well, if there's time. But I'm seeing there's more comments. So I'm thinking that I actually want to ask someone else to speak instead of me. So I think I see Peter Haberton has said something which I think is necessary. And then Tato Tsahutse also said something about, we should create a platform for womanist theology. So unfortunately, I can't see everyone on my screen. So if I can just ask Tato to maybe voice the remark, and then maybe Charlene can respond to that. Tato?
Okay, cool.
I also don't know what everyone's connection is. So while we're waiting for Tato to come on, can Peter maybe say something with the question that he had?
Thank you, Tanya. I think what Charlene said in her sort of final line is what resonates strongly with me, and I think that's wonderful if the survivors could help us to become who we're supposed to be. But I'm also so conscious that, well, if you look at a kind of transformational journey as being one of order, disorder, and reorder, those who are oppressed are very much in the disorder phase. To get through to the reorder phase, they've got to somehow learn to walk with those wounds, like the resurrected Christ does. But is it possible to get there without some sort of consequence against those who have hurt them? I'm just wondering how one gets past that. And I'm thinking of it specifically in the context of the schools at the moment, where there is this dichotomy between black students and white students. I'll leave it there.
Peter, thank you for a great remark, and Tanya for allowing me to just engage it. Peter, I think that is really at the heart of the sort of theological work that I'm interested in, is to create and develop spaces where we are in deep and sacramental conversation with those affected by gender-based violence and those who live with the scars of that on their bodies every day, and who very often have to continue to live within community with the perpetrators of gender-based violence. But I think what I'm learning as I go along on this journey is that I think we want to manage processes, and I often felt this during the engagement, for instance, of the gender-based of the Dutch Reformed Church with sexual diversity. I often felt managed in the process. They want us to get to a certain point, and they are going to create little steps, and we're going to all fall into that process, and then we are going to become this community of care. I think an authentic way to engage trauma and the lived trauma and experiences of people is to create spaces that are often confronting and messy and unmanageable. It's exactly that, to create spaces for that trauma to surface and for people to have less smart ideas and less answers for what's going on, and to truly hear what people are experiencing. And I think I try to touch on something of this when saying that I think this is a complex process, because the perpetrators of gender-based violence is often your father or your uncle or your priest. It's people in positions of power, and if a priest is exposed as someone who perpetrates gender-based violence, it has a fallout on an entire community, and we are not honest enough, and we're not brave enough to set up those very raw spaces to really listen to the experiences of people who have suffered trauma in this regard.
And is the deep listening enough? That's the issue.
I think deep listening over a very long time. I think it's also important to say it doesn't have an expiry date. It's not, okay, like by Friday, everyone now needs to have their things sorted out. It's a repeated, humbling process of listening to those affected.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Peter. This is the end of our first session, basically. We have our second speaker has managed to overcome the current challenges, and we are grateful for that. But before I give over to the next part of the moderator and the session, I really want to thank Charlene, because this is an important conversation, and we keep on repeating this, but it's because the work is not done. And the only thing that we can do is keep on creating this awareness. Evil flourishes where good people do nothing. And I know it's really important that we keep this happening. It's the only thing that will in the end win out. So Charlene, thank you for leading us in this, and thank you for everyone who participated in the chat box. That's gonna be recorded, and I'm sure more conversation will go on. So thank you so much for that. I'm gonna give over to my colleague Jacques now. Thanks.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Charlene. That was very, very deep. We will now give over to our second speaker. Thank you, Reverend Moss. You drove all the way to a new area. So you are online. We thank God for that. I want to introduce to you Reverend Moss Ntla. He's the General Secretary of the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa and pastor of a local congregation in Mohlakeng, west of Johannesburg. And Moss has been a leading voice for decades in thought and action on issues of reconciliation and social justice, mobilizing and educating the evangelical church to live good news in tangible ways. So Reverend Moss, welcome, and thank you for being with us. We are looking forward to your presentation. You have 20 minutes for the presentation, and then we will have a 15-minute discussion and Q&A session. So Reverend Moss, I give over to you. Your mic is still muted.
Reverend Moss, if you can just click on your screen, a mic should pop up. It should be red. You just click on it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Are we good? Am I good to go? Can you hear me?
Good to go.
Fantastic. Thank you for inviting me into this conversation. I'm sorry I had to run and to escape the grid where I'm under load shedding. So I'm in my car now. But we'll try to make it work. Thank you for this discussion. I had the privilege of being able to listen to the most of the last couple of points raised by the previous speaker. And thank you for that, because there are such similarities between the gender-based violence challenges as well as the race challenges that are in some way unmasked by the COVID-19 pandemic. I come at the conversation obviously as a Black South African who has a history or a story of what it feels like to be discriminated against on the basis of race. And anyone who lives in this country would be aware of that history. But secondly, of what it took, the struggle to defeat that, the challenge of racism, which was institutionalized in apartheid as a political system. And also, as a country, we've been through the 1994 transition to a sort of limited victory over racism. And in a sense, we've only after 94 began to realize how deep the damage was with that the racist policy of apartheid that left in our country. Even today, 25 or so years later, we still realize just how damaged our society is in relation to this. And the terrible thing with where we are as a country is that we are unable to name it as racism. We no longer have the possibility, or there is no longer an intelligent way of talking about what we have now as racism. All we can say is that we've defeated racism as a political system, but the damage left is there. And what do we call that damage? Do we call it just poverty? Do we call it the legacy of apartheid? Do we call it, what do we call it? And what is worse is that not only don't we know what to call this thing, we also don't have the weapons ideologically or theologically to deal with it. And so we have to develop some tools about how you deal with what we have in place at this moment. Because once there are no tools, no framework, it means that what it is we have will survive and continue for a long time. But the race question obviously continues to matter, particularly insofar as the poverty that we caused by the entire project of colonialism, of race, of apartheid. All of these things have left us with a situation such as we have, that unfortunately too many people do not have the memory to realize what it is we have, that all of the unemployment that is in place is a result of policies that were in place that were not just policies. Just as a case in point, if you think about how the mining industry in this country needed a labor force, because there was a lot of work to do, and so a lot of people were uprooted from their villages and brought to the gold mining areas. And 100 years later, those mines no longer are viable. And so you have a situation where you force people to leave the land, place them in urban areas and said that there would be jobs for them, and now there aren't jobs, and they don't remember how to farm, which they used to do 100 years ago. So they are unemployed, unskilled, after building a massive economy that depended on them being semi-literate, and now they are there. And what do we do with these people? And they live in townships, their children try to go to school and they have no money to pay, and they say fees must fall, we don't listen. But in the township, everybody knows, I think, that there is a sense in which, even though there's COVID, even though there's an attempt, a spirited attempt by government to tell us about how to fight this pandemic by social distancing, staying at home as far as is possible, and all of these things around mask and sanitizing, all of these things, though they are well and good, but if you put them in a context and environment that is a direct result of racism and the poverty that it brought about, you have townships that simply have no lockdown protocols in place. As a pastor, I'm obviously often confronted with the fact I would phone some of my congregants who live in informal settlements and ask them about how they're doing, and they would say, well, there's no lockdown where we are. People are out milling about in the streets, and I'd say, why? And they say, well, you can't stay indoors if you're hungry. And no matter what the dangers are, you leave your shack to go look for food. And that instinct for survival just simply means that people are not going to be observing these protocols. And so all of that, because of what is known as the social determinants, socio-economic determinants of health that we had to deal with when we were struggling with Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals before that. All of these factors say that poor communities are obviously at a disadvantage with regard to how not only their readiness to combat this disease, but also the sense of being able to protect themselves. We also have a situation that the number of ICU beds that are in the country, all things told, and the number of ventilators that are there simply mean that the access to those will be very limited. And so over the next, by Christmas, when Christmas gets here, there will be many people who are expected to die. And it's not rocket science to guess who will do most of the dying. It will be those that are on the poorest side of our social hierarchy. Now, all of these are obviously all well known to us. I think what the challenge of our conversation here is not simply to analyze what is going on, but to transform it and to figure out how best to move the human race to the next level of its development in terms of the achievement of prosperity for all people. Now that is the challenge I'd like to offer a few reflections about. About 75 years ago, almost to date, there was a meeting in Manchester, in England, where a lot of the people who fought the liberation struggle on this continent, who led it, who were sort of the fathers of the different countries in their on the continent, people like Kwame Nkrumah and others. They had a meeting in 1945 in Manchester, where many of them were forced in exile, and discussed the condition after the war of Africa and what it would take to liberate this continent from racism. And so this year in August, we were going to, the plan was to have a moment to pause to think about what of the Manchester meeting, and there was a Manchester declaration that pointed out to the fact that the liberation of Africa would have to include the political, the economic, the cultural, and the spiritual dimension of our continent. And so 75 years on, to assess, have we succeeded? Have we been able to complete that project of liberation? And quite clearly, the answer would be no. The answer is that we probably have settled the political challenge, but the cultural, the economic, the spiritual remains a problem. And so the idea is how do we then take that struggle that was talked about in a sense in 1945. And by the way, 10 years from that date of that meeting, the political liberation of Ghana was accomplished. So you had, because of the determined leadership of these people, they began systematically to work at the liberation, politically speaking, of the African continent. So we are, as a country, South Africa is probably the last three countries. There will be some who would argue that there are other countries that are still not free. But the majority of those countries about which these leaders in 1945 met have been set free. So we are at that place now where we have to think again, what is missing? How do we bring about this transformation so that it doesn't make Africa permanently vulnerable to things such as are making us vulnerable now, COVID-19, HIV, illiteracy, spiritual dependence on Western models of faith. I mean, you still have today African people singing songs that were invented in the West. Amazing Grace is a typical one where you have a song that was written by slave owners, beautiful song that talks to amazing grace. However, wouldn't it be wonderful for us to hear what former slaves, if they were to express their view and vision of God and what they really felt about God, and those that have decided to be Christians in my particular context, speak as a Christian, what would people like that say? How would they worship? Rather than simply become a people that quote models of faith, worship, witness, that are basically colonial in some way. And I think that speaks not only to the question of race, it speaks to the question of gender. It speaks to how we define the problems such as we have. I think part of the crisis is that we have not correctly identified what to call the problems that we have. And our ideological tools are not adequate. You know, for example, if you think about gender-based violence, is it gender-based violence when a father rapes his own daughter or his mother? It seems that the calling it gender-based violence is so inadequate for the monstrosity of the crime and the evil that is entailed there. And so I think our tools are adequate to describe our dilemmas. And that is the reason that often working with those ideological tools, we've come up with policies and frameworks that in the end are inadequate. I think our country has one of the most progressive constitutions, but is it adequate? I was listening to a fellow church leader, colleague, Archbishop of Cape Town, in a conversation with church leaders about gender-based violence, and he was saying, in frustration, almost saying, we, in the Anglican Church, we've got all sorts of policies in place. We've taken all the precautions, but there still is a big gap between where we would like to be and where we are. And so I'm looking for something else that will work. What is it? And so I think that is the crisis that we have. We've got ideological tools and definitions that have run their course. And I think that, and perhaps it isn't because those things are wrong. I think it is just that they are not adequate. And I'll say the following. Firstly, I think that added to the policy work, there's a lot of policy work that's been done, which is just tremendous. And there are institutional supports for those policies, there are budget allocations. But what is lacking is the spiritual willingness, commitment, not only the political one, the spiritual commitment to embrace the struggles that we need. And why is it so? I think for a large part, a lot of the people who must drive the challenge to end racism or gender-based violence are themselves beneficiaries of inequalities that are that way. So if you have soldiers who must end a problem and they are beneficiaries of that problem, you have a serious problem. And so spiritually, I think that, let me put it this way, according to scriptural tradition, the nature of the evil we fight is not simply sociological, it is spiritual, it is, Paul writes in Ephesians that your enemy is much worse than you think. It's not just that you fight flesh and blood. That would have been easy. You just take an AK-47 if it is flesh and blood you're fighting. But if it is principalities and powers that would have in their sway large swathes of humanity under their spell, then your problem is much worse. And I think if you don't engage at that level, you are probably going to be wiping the floors of water without shutting the tap. So that's the first thing. I think we have to rediscover the spiritual tools of engaging principalities and powers, because in the end, they fund these problems. They fund things like capitalism, they fund patriarchy, they fund racism. And somebody said, why is it easier to imagine the end of time eschatologically than to imagine the end of capitalism? It's probably because of how deeply it is entrenched. So we have to deal with that. Second, I think we have to deal with how, drawing from our spiritual resources, we actually incarnate the struggles about which we speak. The story of the incarnation talks about all of us inserting ourselves in those struggles that matter to the majority of people who suffer. Our world is full of suffering that is caused by people. And the task at hand, pastorally speaking, is, can we mobilize sufficient people to abandon their position of privilege to insert themselves in the struggles of the poor? I think the story of Beasnadi is always one that I find remarkable and charming, and commends itself to us. Ombe used to be a racist. He used to be a broederbonder. And then he deliberately switched side and decided he was going to be part of the struggle that Black people were engaged in. And he, to his dying day, never regretted that, because it opened a new world of being, firstly as a Christian, a new world of being a neighbor, a new world of being a South African. And although he was ostracized, in the end, I think most Afrikaners would say he's a hero in the Afrikaner community. So, but it doesn't come while people cling on to the privileges of power. And my submission is, without the spiritual stamina and strength to make that incarnational switch, we will continue to trust police to combat crime who are themselves corrupt, to trust presidents to lead our nation who are themselves rapists, and all of these things. And we will have policies that are constructs of our best thinking about these problems, but they lack the spiritual force that makes those practical and implementable. And so I think if we imagine a triangle of spiritual engagement with the powers that, as the scripture tells us, in principalities and powers, connect that as a second point in the triangle, the practical incarnation of what it is we're talking about, where race, the massive power that is in the hands of racism, that is accumulated capital of racism for generations, centuries. How do we inspire people to use that power to serve transformation? It can't be coercion. It almost needs to be a spiritual challenge that speaks to the deepest core of a racist or a gender-based or a violent man who violates people who are weaker than themselves. Because in the end, it's the abuse of power, whether it's the power of race, the power of whiteness, or the power of maleness, or the power of class. We need the church to ignite in the imagination of power holders that the model Jesus has given us is that if you think you have any power at all, which Jesus had, he was the most powerful human being on earth. He laid that aside and washed his disciples' feet. And so I think that is a compelling picture to paint, not only for church, obviously, and we are not doing very well to even do it at church, but it's a picture to hold to society that if you have power, economic, educational, whatever power you hold, ought to be brought into the service of humanity. And then to have those policies that translate that into a policy framework that can then be implemented by people who are themselves transformed. I think those are the thoughts I thought to share, and I'll pause there. Thank you very much.
Most thank you so much. Thank you for those, and thank you for making the commitment to find us again in your car all over the place. But thank you. Tools. Our language is not adequate. The call for a spirituality. Just the fact that you had to struggle to get on this call. If we start to analyze the causes of that, the causes of load shedding. What sits behind all of that? And some of that can be traced back to exactly what you were speaking about. Spirituality, the willingness to incarnate ourselves in different places. We have about 10 minutes. Moss, if you can stay on the call with us and let us hear if you can again use your comment box, because I think that way we will have more chance of people participating. Now, I don't know, Moss, if you can see that. Otherwise, I will just raise. Can you see the comments that people post or not?
No, I can't see the comment.
You can't. Okay. So just if any of those who posted, Joan and Tanya, Selina, Clippies, if you want to raise that, because those are big issues that you mentioned here. Selina was saying, highlighting how well-developed economic centers of South Africa were built on the labor of black bodies, and even presently with cheap labor. I think you made a very strong point there, the intersection between race and economics up to today. Clippies, how helpful is it to speak of racism as a pandemic and gender-based violence as an epidemic? It's a question. These medical metaphors highlight some aspects of these systemic ideologies, but are a serious underestimation of what is involved. I think you also alluded to that, Amos, our language just falls short. It's not a quick fix, says Joan Daba. Gender, race inequalities and other situations are exposed by COVID, but they've always been there. Discussions about power, sometimes very abstract, Tanya say, but it's in the end about in whose hands the power suitcase is. And still the unwillingness. Okay, I don't know. Any comments you want to make on any of those, Moss, or otherwise any of those who wrote that? If you want to, in a one-liner, ask your question, perhaps so Moss can respond.
Thanks, Stephen. That will help. I think I only got the question around how helpful it is to speak about racism as a pandemic.
Yeah.
And JBV one as an epidemic and the other as a pandemic. My medical knowledge of those terms of what is a pandemic and what is epidemic eludes me. I suppose that the epidemic is the pandemic light, and that the pandemic is when the epidemic has evolved to something exponentially bigger than that. I don't know if it is a helpful way to think about them. I think the problem with the calculus of sin and trying to quantify which sin is worse, which sin causes the most damage, which sin is more widespread, which sin is I don't know that it is helpful. And what I'm missing in a lot of the sociology of the human predicament is that it doesn't capture sufficiently the spiritual depth that is implied in the crisis that we face. And so I'd like to see more admission into the equation of our combat with these ills, a spiritual dimension, because I think that is at the root of all of these things. I remember when the TRC was first started, we had a situation where we were talking with the then president and saying, I think it was President Mbeki, we're talking about the fact that the TRC was really playing games with the poor when it set up the reparation fund, which only gave a few thousands of rands to people who had suffered gravely. And some of them had lost limbs, some of them had lost their parents, and so on. And he said to us then that the problem with this thing is that you can't quantify someone who lost their life in the combat against apartheid and someone who lost a limb. And so as a result of that, we have to settle for symbolic reparation. We'll build a monument here, we'll do this and that. So in a sense, that was the best we could do to deal with these challenges of what racism caused. And perhaps that is an economy of our sort can do more there are constraints to that, but that there are no constraints, there are no limits to the damage and the rampant damage that the sin of racism has caused. And so we've got to find adequate language to describe it, but more effectively to solve it. Yeah.
Just Selina, can you just perhaps, thanks for that, Moss. Selina, can you just perhaps in a short sentence or two just ask the question that you raised there?
Yeah, probably just taking on, continuing from what Moss was just saying. I mean, the issue of the church, we're not well equipped, it seems. We've been separate in our worship, and we haven't done a lot of deeper work cross-racially. So how do we even have the moral authority to speak to racism? And then with, again, much like the gender issue, where for the most part, the white church has benefited from apartheid, and then how do they now deal in a serious way with that in having conversation just by themselves? I mean, we haven't managed to have resources spiritually to deal with racism, first among our own separate groups in that sense, and the beneficiaries in particular.
Mm.
Moss, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that as I understand the question is that we haven't had sufficient adult conversations between the different race groups that can lead to transformation. Am I correct? Is that the gist of it?
Yes. Yeah.
If that is the case, I think again I normally think about it this way, that the finest among us, and I'll use Bears Nadi as an example. Bears Nadi is an Afrikaner racist who at one point in his ministry as a theologian and pastor started talking with his black colleagues, and for the first time he had a window on life in this country for the majority of people, and that immediately clarified for him the choices he must make. And so to the degree that we still have the barriers of space, of economics, of racial groups that are not cross-connecting, we don't have those illuminating conversation with people of other races, which for Bears, in Bears' case, became almost like a theophany of sorts, where for the first time he understood his life's mission. We are currently denying, and perhaps that is part of the problem, that we have politically ended apartheid. So it's not there politically, and the narrative is that it doesn't exist anymore. So racism doesn't exist anymore. And so people have no incentive to think about, even if they themselves have not pulled the trigger of racism, but they are living off the benefits of it. And they haven't got a clue that this is the case, that they're living off the proceeds of crime. It's almost like a need to recapture the memory of the past in order, again, to make that a compelling case for how people make choices today. And that is perhaps also part of what the church should do, to create moments of cross-cultural engagement that would lead to transformation.
Mos, thank you. There's many comments here, and we only have 2 minutes left. Jerry say thank you for connecting racism to the realities of life again, Mos. I think you have now touched on what Selina, she was asking, but she was also specifically asking what you just touched on. Those who inherited the benefits of the economy due to racism, how can they take serious responsibility for poverty in Black communities beyond charity? And I think that question we must still work with, and I hope both Charlene and Mos, you'll be willing to engage us more later as well. And then there was a question from the Lutheran chapter: how can the church become again a site of struggle? We don't have time to ask that now, but I think that maybe is a question that could hang with us for a moment. How can and also churches that might not have seen themselves as site of struggle before, because struggle is not the language of all churches, but struggle around issues of racial justice, issues of gender justice. I want us to wrap up there. I wonder, Mos, if you have a very last word of encouragement to us, and then I'm going to just wrap us up. Any one-liner, and maybe I can ask. I see Charlene there. Maybe after Mos, Charlene, listening to both, if you also want to just throw in one sentence of encouraging, of challenge to us. Both of you, please. Mos?
Yeah, I think for me it is important to rediscover our spirituality and ground it on Jesus Christ, his model, his witness, his message. That is our only hope. And the extent to which we can do it together as communities so that we mutually correct each other's blind spots, that would be a good way to go.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Charlene?
Stefan and colleagues and Mos, thank you so much for also your reflections. I think this afternoon just again highlighted the complexity at that moment of intersection when race, class, religion, sexuality, when those things meet each other and is informed by our religion and our theology, how complex that conversation is. And maybe just, especially the remark by Selina right at the end, the importance for us to reflect on our privilege on numerous levels, not only in terms of race, but also in terms of gender and sexuality, and how easy it is for us to have blind spots if we are the beneficiaries of systemic realities of oppression. So thank you very much for a really rich conversation and an ongoing conversation. It's not like we figured out the answer. It's just part of an ongoing reflection and engagement. Thank you so much, Stefan and colleagues.
Thank you so much. In closing, thank you to both of you. We really appreciate you. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be on the call again, same time, same space, on COVID-19, the economy and the environment. And already I think some of the reflections this afternoon definitely led us into the economy and the close relationship between these issues. I'm going to ask that we close in this way. You have the chat room. Unfortunately, Mos, you can't see that, but I can read out. If you want to just use it, all the participants who want to, just maybe from what you heard this afternoon as you listened, if there's one word or one phrase that comes to mind, it could be a word of discernment or of provocation or of inspiration that you want to just capture for yourself as we close this time. We are capturing all of what we have here. It's recorded. Because we don't want to just leave it here. We want to discern what is this telling us in terms of how we do theology today. So anybody that is welcome, if there's any word that you want to post there on the chat box, just as a parting word, let's use a minute or two for that. Encouragement, provocation, inspiration, wake, arise, contextual, rational, challenged, food for deep thinking, insightful, incarnation, enlightening, relevant, alive, informative, much needed conversation to ground throughout our various spaces, apathy to change, rediscover our spirituality and reground it in Christ, struggle, grounding. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for participating. Thank you especially to Charlene and Moss for being with us, and hope that most of you will be back in 2 weeks' time. May God bless you, and go well and have a good weekend as well. Thank you. That's the end of the conversation.